Exodus chapter 21, part 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 27 in this chapter today. And what we're looking at are laws protecting the sanctity of life and also laws protecting the protection of life, plus laws of retaliation, which means fair and just compensation. Let's look at some introductory comments, considering that the Mosaic laws have stirred up controversy at times. Now, first, the idea here is this is a continuation of chapter 20, because there weren't any chapters until the 13th century when Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, added them to make it easier to find one's way through various points in the Bible. Also, we want to remember the Ten Commandments or words are the first of these over 600 laws which we'll encounter, and I can assure you we're not going through all 600 whatever laws. But there are also the grand principles that undergird these subsequent laws. Now, chapter 21 begins with instructions on how to treat slaves and servants, and this immediately sets their social order apart from all of the other nations of that time. Jehovah begins with a focus on people in the lowest social scale, slaves and servants. Other nations focused on their highest ranking people, with slaves having very few, if any, laws to protect them. Now, the laws listed here are case laws. They are regulations designed to cover problems which might appear, but you do not assume ideal situations. So we're not reading about ideal situations here. We're learning about what to do if something wrong happens. Now, Mosaic law doesn't assume that Israelites should sell their daughters as slaves, which we'll run into here in verses 7 through 11. They just describe what rules to follow if someone does this. In other words, these laws do not present best case scenarios. We should never read them that way. Now, about slaves. Hebrew does not have a word that matches with our concept of slave. Instead, their word ebed means servant or even employee, and in the examples in chapter 21 refers to indentured servants. Also, the term of servitude, is 6 years, after which a servant is freed from his obligation to the master. Now, the word for master is Adon, Lord, employer, or boss. Leviticus 25 further clarifies this relationship. We need to read this. Like a man hired year by year, he shall be with him. That's the servant. He, the master, shall not rule over him with severity in your sight. Even if he is not redeemed by these means, he shall still go out in the year of Jubilee, he and his sons with him. So we have some coverage here for people. Okay, here I'm going to borrow heavily from the book Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, published in 2011. Now, the servant laws given to Moses were aimed at controlling or regulating, not idealizing in an inferior work arrangement. Now, servanthood came about through poverty, and it was entered into voluntarily. It was a contract. The purpose of these laws was to deter potential abuses of poor people. Now, the poor were given many opportunities to avoid deep poverty, which would drive them to take on work as servants. They were allowed to glean the edges of crop fields, like Ruth, and to pick remaining fruit on trees after harvest. And we can see this in Leviticus 19 and chapter 23 and Deuteronomy 24. The Israelites were forbidden to charge interest to their own people. And that's in the next chapter here in Exodus and also Leviticus 25. If someone couldn't afford costly sacrificial animals like a goat or a cow or an ox, they could choose to sacrifice smaller and less expensive ones. And that's Leviticus 5. And that's what Mary and Joseph with Jesus did. Now, all debts were to be canceled every 7th year. And upon leaving, the servants were to be generously provided for without a grudging heart. That's in Deuteronomy 15. The ultimate goal here that we have to keep in mind was to have no poverty in Israel, and thus no servitude among the Israelites. Verse 1, and these are the ordinances which you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. Hebrew slaves were actually indentured servants who agreed to serve for 6 years and then be released in the 7th. They were never to be kept forever against their will. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it was against the will of God. If a Hebrew servant became so attached to his master, he could agree to stay with him permanently. Now, why would he want to do that? If his master had given him a wife, and she and any children they had would belong to the master. That's for the 6 years of her contract. She's under contract also. And so the husband would leave without his family. However, he could choose to stay with his family by having his ear pierced so that he would wear a ring showing that he belonged to the master permanently. And moreover, a servant might find his master was a wonderful person to work for, and so choose to stay with the master for that reason. Now, I even thought afterwards it could be, say, if there was a long and terrible famine occurring in the land, it might make sense for someone who was poor and had very small property, a plot of land to farm, to join himself to a large landowner to avoid starvation. Now, what we have here, too, is the wife is under a separate 6-year contract. So this is for men and women. So she would be obligated to finish her term of employment. What we see here is a picture of Christ who took on our humanity to save us. We have in Philippians 2, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus didn't have to do this for us, He's God. He could have just stayed in heaven. He chose to empty himself to become as a servant to save us from our sins by his death on the cross. He could have stayed in heaven, but we then would all be lost and with no hope. Verse 7, if a man sells his daughter as a female servant, she is not to go free as the male servants do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these 3 things for her, then she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money. Okay, why? Some families were so poor that they would sell their daughter or daughters to another Israelite with the idea that he would treat her as a handmaiden and not as a servant or slave. Further, the hope was that the man would marry her through proper ceremony with a marriage contract, which is called the chetubah. I'm not sure about that pronunciation. The man could make her his concubine, but that did not require this contract. A Hebrew man was barred from selling his wife by contract. He could not do it, but he could sell a concubine. So a provision for this was included that he could not sell her to any Gentile. He could have her marry his son, which would make her his daughter-in-law and a member of the family. If the man marries another woman instead of her, that's what the verse 10 really is alluding to there, she'll retain her right to food, clothing, and lodging. The best translation for conjugal rights, the word there is onam, which is found only in this one place in the whole Bible, is dwelling place or lodging based on the root of the word. If he did none of the above, then the daughter would be free to return home. In other words, a man who purchases someone else's daughter cannot do whatever he wishes with her. She has rights under the protection of this law of Jehovah. Verse 12, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place to which he may flee. Now, if however, a man acts presumptuously toward his neighbor, so as to kill him craftily, you are to take him even from my altar, that he may die. Now, verses 12 through 17 deal with the sanctity of life. Life is very valuable to God. Verse 12 directly connects back to word number 6, you shall not murder. But it adds the clarification that if the death is accidental, the killer can flee to a refuge city. Now we have to go to Numbers chapter 35 to see what that's all about. But they had a place where they could flee, and if they stayed there, it couldn't be touched. At least not until the judgment has been made based on the evidence as to whether it was real murder or it was accidental. Okay. It makes no difference between whether the murder is committed in the heat of the moment or if it was planned with a malice aforethought. That's verse 14. In other words, it doesn't matter whether you just blew your stack and murdered somebody or if you plotted it out. Either way, you're going to be executed. Now, verse 15 carries forward. He who strikes his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. Okay, a physical attack on a parent is considered equal to murder. He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. Selling people into slavery, human trafficking we call it now, also requires the death penalty, whether you're the one who sold or whether you're the one who purchased. He who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Now, the word for curse here is kalal, which means a son who is insulting to or else is embarrassing to his parents because he's a deadbeat or a bum. Okay, this means continuing behavior, not just that he goofed off over a weekend. This would include a son who did not take care of his parents when they were in need. Now, we see here that Jehovah expanded the concept of murder to cover the general principle of sanctity of life. God offers no mercy for such perpetrators, no chance of rehabilitation like we do now. Human life is all important to our Lord. Verse 18, if men have a quarrel, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but remains in bed, if he gets up and walks around outside on his staff, then he who struck him shall go unpunished. He shall only pay for his loss of time and shall take care of him until he's completely healed. If a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. That means he's under contract. Now, these verses focus on the protection of human life. We even see later that's protection of animal life as well. And the concept of recompense is involved here, that offenses require equal and fair compensation as a consequence of the wrongdoing. In verse 18, if two people get in a fight and one is injured, the other must pay for damages and treatment of the injured and also cover the cost of loss of time at work. Now, first of all, they shouldn't be fighting anyway. They have judges they can go to settle a matter. So this is not an ideal situation. Not saying, okay, you're okay to go to fisticuffs here and beat each other up. No. Verse 20, if a master strikes a servant during correction, it says with a rod, means a large rod, meaning a big stick, and causes his death, he shall be punished according to the decision of the judges. Now, it's interesting. The term punished is nakam in Hebrew and can mean the death penalty. So this includes the death penalty here. Thus, if the so-called correction is truly brutal, the judges may decide that the master must be executed for it. First of all, he killed an Israelite, and he did it going back a few verses in the heat of the moment of anger or whatever, just blew his stack and smacked him over the head and killed him. You're going to die too, sir. Now, if the servant survives for a while, then there's no judgment. And why is that? It cannot then be clearly determined if the servant died from the injury inflicted by the master or if by some other, say, underlying condition. And again, this matter was to be decided by the judges. Verse 22, if men struggle with each other and strike a woman with trials so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as a woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now, boy, this set of verses has attracted a lot of attention. And there's some other religions who follow it and claim it and use it just as it says. But Christianity and also the Israelites were not supposed to literally do that. The word is not that they must do it, but that they may do it. Now, these verses, as we go forward through to verse 27, introduce the laws of retaliation, and this also includes this idea of a just compensation for losses. In verse 22, we have a pregnant woman when these guys are fighting and she gets injured, gets kicked in the belly or something, or falls down, and it leads to her miscarriage. The guilty party must pay a fine defined by the woman's husband. Wow. If there are any husbands who are listening to this lesson, and someone hurt your wife, knocked her down or whatever while during an altercation with you, and it causes the unborn child to be lost, think about how high a fine you would assign to that person. I bet it would be astronomical. Anyway, the judges have the final word on this matter. Okay, as can be imagined, it could be really high due to the loss of the child. Now in verse 23, the concept of fair and equal compensation is developed further. It does not mean that a literal tooth, eye, hand, or foot must be removed. Again, the judges can adjudicate fair and equitable compensation for losses from bodily harm. Now, the Bible does not teach mutilation. It was not part of the Hebrew justice system. This doesn't mean that no Israelite ever did perform actual mutilation. Some of the kings did, but it was not authorized by God. Now, it is very true that today, Sharia law, part of Islam, does allow for this and in fact commands it. They've used this verse out of Exodus as their rationale. Verse 26, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him or her go free on account of his eye. And if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him or her go free on account of his tooth. Okay, this explains the rules for injuries inflicted by a master on his servants. Okay, get a correction, it goes wrong. For whatever reason, it kind of goes back to verse 20, but these are injuries, it's not death. Okay, it requires that the servant be released and go free. Okay, it doesn't matter what the contract was, that broke the contract. And it's true whether it's the case of a male or a female servant. Women have rights here. This is another clear example of God's laws differ drastically from that of the pagan nations. And as you look at archaeology and history, other nations had slaves. They had no rights at all, while non-slave servants may have had some rights. But God shows here that he holds very high the intrinsic value of human life. Also, we must remember Leviticus chapter 25, where it says that the Lord or the employer cannot mistreat his servants of either sex. Here's what it says. Like a man hired year by year, you shall be with him. You shall not rule over him with severity in your sight. Even if he is not redeemed by these means, he shall still go out in the year of Jubilee, he and his sons with him. We also see that there is no difference, I want to emphasize that, between male and female servants according to the Lord. And this was drastically different from all the other cultures of that day. Okay, we're going to continue next week with our study of the Mosaic Law. Really, it's chapters 21, 22, and 23 that we're looking at. And what we've found so far is that God cares and makes provision for the poor. He recognizes and holds high the sanctity of life. He makes provision for the protection of life. And he demands fair and just compensation for loss of life and values the health of all Israelites and their livestock, as we're going to see.